As American and British forces advanced into Germany in late 1944 and early 1945, they made a series of discoveries that shocked and alarmed them. Nazi Germany, despite losing the war, had made remarkable scientific and technological advances in several fields. Some of these advances were years or even decades ahead of anything the United States or Britain possessed. American intelligence officers, scientists, and military leaders realized that this scientific knowledge represented enormous potential military and economic value. The question quickly became not whether to capture this knowledge, but how to capture it before the Soviet Union did the same thing. The first major discoveries came as American forces overran German research facilities, weapons testing grounds, and manufacturing plants. They found partially completed weapons that were far more advanced than anything the Allies had seen. They found research documents describing technologies that seemed almost like science fiction. They found underground factories where slave laborers had manufactured advanced weapons under horrific conditions. And most importantly, they found the scientists and engineers who had created all of this, many of whom were eager to avoid capture by Soviet forces and were willing to work for whoever would take them. The V-2 rocket program and Werner von Braun. The most significant Nazi technology that America captured was the V-2 rocket program. The V-2 was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile and the first human-made object to reach space. It was a technological marvel, years ahead of anything the United States had developed. The rocket stood 46 feet tall, weighed over 27,000 pounds, could carry a 1-ton warhead, and could travel at speeds up to 3,600 miles per hour over a range of 200 miles. Nazi Germany had launched over 3,000 V-2 rockets against Allied targets, primarily London and Antwerp, killing approximately 9,000 people and causing immense destruction. The man who led the V-2 program was Werner von Braun, a brilliant rocket engineer who had been obsessed with space travel since childhood. Von Braun was 33 years old when the war ended. He held the rank of Sturmbannführer, equivalent to major, in the SS, the Nazi organization responsible for running concentration camps and carrying out genocide. The V-2 rockets that von Braun designed were manufactured at an underground facility called Mittelwerk, where approximately 60,000 prisoners from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp worked as slave laborers. An estimated 20,000 of these prisoners died from the brutal working conditions, starvation, disease, and deliberate killings. More people died building the V-2 rockets than were killed by the rockets themselves when they were used as weapons. Von Braun was directly involved with the Mittelwerk facility. He visited it regularly, selected skilled prisoners to work on technical aspects of rocket production, and was fully aware of the conditions in which the prisoners worked and died. Evidence from survivors indicates that von Braun witnessed prisoners being hanged for sabotage, and that he personally requested specific prisoners from the concentration camp to work on his rockets. After the war, von Braun always claimed that he had been forced to join the SS against his will, that he had no choice, and that he had been unaware of the full extent of the atrocities. Historical evidence contradicts these claims. Von Braun was an enthusiastic Nazi who joined the party in 1937, well before it was required for his work, and who joined the SS in 1940. He wore his SS uniform proudly and socialized with senior SS officers. As Germany collapsed in the spring of 1945, von Braun made a calculated decision. He knew the war was lost. He knew that the Soviet Union, the United States, and Britain were all racing to capture German rocket technology. He decided that surrendering to the Americans offered him the best chance to continue his work and to avoid prosecution for his role in using slave labor. Von Braun gathered his top engineers and hundreds of technical documents and moved them to southern Germany. On May 2, 1945, von Braun's younger brother Magnus, who spoke English, approached American troops and arranged for Werner von Braun and his team to surrender to the United States military. Operation Paperclip begins. The American operation to recruit Nazi scientists was originally called Operation Overcast, but it was renamed Operation Paperclip in 1946. The name came from the paperclips that were attached to the files of Nazi scientists deemed valuable enough to recruit, marking them for special handling. The operation was run by the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, a special organization created specifically for this purpose. The stated goal was to deny German scientific expertise to the Soviet Union and to exploit it for American military and scientific advancement. There was one significant legal and moral problem with this plan. President Harry Truman had issued an explicit order prohibiting the recruitment of any Nazi who had been an active member of the Nazi Party or who had been involved in war crimes or crimes against humanity. This order reflected American values and the commitment to punishing Nazi crimes that had been expressed at the Nuremberg trials, which were beginning at the same time. However, the military intelligence officers and scientists running Operation Paperclip believed that winning the emerging Cold War against the Soviet Union was more important than punishing Nazi crimes. They decided to systematically lie about and cover up the Nazi pasts of the scientists they wanted to recruit. Operation Paperclip officials created false biographies for Nazi scientists. They destroyed or hid evidence of Nazi Party membership. They minimized or completely omitted information about involvement in war crimes and slave labor. They wrote favorable reports describing these Nazi scientists as having been opponents of the Nazi regime, or as having been coerced into Nazi activities against their will. These false biographies were then presented to senior officials and to the State Department visa office to obtain approval for bringing these Germans to the United States. In many cases, the officials approving the immigration did not know they were being deceived. In other cases, they knew but chose to look the other way because they agreed that Cold War priorities justified the deception. Over the course of Operation Paperclip, which officially ran from 1945 to 1959, but continued informally even longer, the United States recruited more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians. Many of these men had been deeply involved in the Nazi regime. Some had been members of the Nazi Party. Some had been members of the SS. Some had used concentration camp prisoners as slave labor. Some had conducted cruel human experiments. All of this was deliberately hidden so that they could work for the United States government and American corporations. Werner von Braun's American career. Werner von Braun became the most famous and successful of all the Operation Paperclip scientists. After his surrender, he and his team were brought to Fort Bliss in Texas, where they began working with the United States Army to develop rocket technology. They brought with them not only their expertise, but also actual V-2 rocket components that had been captured in Germany. The Americans had seized enough components to assemble approximately 100 complete V-2 rockets. Von Braun and his German engineers taught American scientists and engineers how the rockets worked and how to launch them. In 1950, von Braun and his team were transferred to Huntsville, Alabama, where they worked at the Redstone Arsenal, developing ballistic missiles for the United States Army. Von Braun became the director of the Development Operations Division, essentially making him the leader of the American rocket program. He and his German team developed the Redstone rocket, which was America's first large ballistic missile. The Redstone was basically an improved version of the German V-2. Von Braun then developed the Jupiter missile, which was even more powerful and became a crucial component of American nuclear deterrence during the Cold War. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in October 1957, becoming the first nation to put an artificial satellite into orbit, America was shocked and humiliated. This event triggered the space race, and the United States government poured enormous resources into catching up with the Soviets. Von Braun and his team became central to this effort. In 1958, von Braun's team successfully launched Explorer 1, America's first satellite, using a Jupiter-C rocket that von Braun had designed. This partially restored American pride and proved that the United States could compete in space. In 1960, von Braun and his team were transferred from the Army to the newly created National Aeronautics and Space Administration, known as NASA. Von Braun became the director of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, one of NASA's most important facilities. He led the development of the Saturn family of rockets, which were the most powerful rockets ever built at that time. The Saturn V rocket, von Braun's masterpiece, stood 363 feet tall, weighed over 6 million pounds when fully fueled, and could lift over 260,000 pounds into low Earth orbit. It was the Saturn V that carried American astronauts to the moon. On July 16, 1969, a Saturn V rocket, designed by Wernher von Braun's team, launched Apollo 11 toward the moon. 4 days later, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first humans to walk on the lunar surface. This was perhaps America's greatest technological achievement of the 20th century, accomplished with rockets designed by a former Nazi SS officer who had used slave labor from concentration camps. Von Braun was celebrated as a hero. He appeared on television with Walt Disney, promoting space exploration to millions of Americans. He received numerous awards and honors. He became a naturalized American citizen in 1955. The darker aspects of his past were known to American intelligence agencies, but were deliberately kept secret from the public. The truth about von Braun's Nazi past did not become widely known until the 1980s, long after his death in 1977. When reporters and historians began investigating and publishing information about Operation Paperclip and von Braun's use of slave labor, it created significant controversy. Some people argued that von Braun should be remembered primarily for his contributions to American space exploration, and that his Nazi past, while regrettable, had been adequately addressed by his work for America. Others argued that von Braun should be considered a war criminal who escaped justice through American protection, and that celebrating him dishonors the thousands of concentration camp prisoners who died building his rockets. This debate continues today, with historians and ethicists still disagreeing about how to properly assess von Braun's legacy. Arthur Rudolph and the Saturn V. Arthur Rudolph was another key Nazi scientist who became crucial to the American space program. Rudolph had been the production director at the Mittelwerk facility, where V-2 rockets were manufactured by concentration camp slave labor. He was directly responsible for the production process, and therefore directly responsible for the conditions under which tens of thousands of prisoners worked. and thousands died. Survivors testified that Rudolf was personally involved in selecting prisoners for execution when production quotas were not met, and that he showed no concern for the prisoners' suffering. Despite this background, or rather because American officials deliberately hid this background, Rudolf was brought to the United States through Operation Paperclip. He worked alongside von Braun, developing American rockets. He became the project director for the Saturn V rocket program, the same program that put Americans on the moon. He received NASA's highest honor, the Distinguished Service Medal, in 1969 for his work on the Saturn V. He became a naturalized American citizen in 1954. Rudolf's Nazi past remained hidden until 1984, when investigators from the Office of Special Investigations, a Justice Department office created to identify and prosecute Nazi war criminals living in the United States, began examining his case. When confronted with evidence of his role in using slave labor and his involvement in atrocities at Mittelwerk, Rudolf chose to renounce his American citizenship and return to Germany rather than face prosecution. He left the United States in 1984 and lived in Germany until his death in 1996. He never expressed remorse for his actions during the war and always claimed he had simply been doing his job. Hubertus Strughold and aviation medicine. Hubertus Strughold was a German physiologist who specialized in aviation medicine, the study of how the human body responds to the conditions of flight. He conducted research for the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, during World War II. After the war, he was recruited through Operation Paperclip and brought to the United States, where he continued his aviation medicine research for the United States Air Force and later for NASA. He is often called the father of space medicine because his research on how the human body responds to extreme conditions was crucial to the American space program. However, evidence suggests that Strughold was involved in or aware of cruel human experiments conducted by Nazi doctors. These experiments involved exposing concentration camp prisoners to extreme conditions such as high altitude, extreme cold, and rapid decompression to study how the human body responded. Many prisoners died during these experiments or suffered permanent injuries. Documents discovered after the war show that Strughold attended medical conferences where this research was presented and discussed. Whether he personally conducted such experiments or merely knew about them and used the data remains a subject of historical debate, but his connection to these atrocities is clear. Despite this background, Strughold had a distinguished career in the United States. He became a professor at the School of Aviation Medicine in Texas. He published numerous scientific papers. An award for excellence in space medicine was named after him. His name appeared on buildings and awards throughout the aerospace medicine community. When his Nazi connections became better known in the 1990s, there were efforts to remove his name from these honors. Some institutions did remove his name, while others chose to keep it, arguing that his scientific contributions should be separated from his moral failings. Kurt Blome and biological warfare research. Kurt Blome was a high-ranking Nazi doctor who had been Deputy Surgeon General of the Third Reich. He had conducted research on biological warfare agents, including experiments with plague bacteria. He was tried at Nuremberg for conducting human experiments on concentration camp prisoners, but he was acquitted due to lack of evidence, though many historians believe the acquittal was incorrect and that evidence of his crimes existed but was not presented properly at trial. Despite being tried at Nuremberg, despite being accused of human experimentation, and despite his senior position in the Nazi medical hierarchy, Kurt Blome was recruited by the United States in 1951 to work on biological warfare research. He was brought to the United States to share his knowledge about biological weapons with American military researchers. He worked at Camp King, an American military installation in Germany, and provided information about biological warfare programs. American officials justified recruiting Blome by arguing that his knowledge was valuable and that preventing the Soviet Union from recruiting him was a strategic priority. He was eventually released and returned to Germany, where he lived until his death in 1969. Walter Schreiber and medical experiments. Walter Schreiber was a German military doctor who had been one of the most senior medical officers in the Nazi regime. He held the rank of Major General and was responsible for overseeing medical research for the German military. Evidence shows that he was aware of and possibly involved in approving human experiments on concentration camp prisoners, including experiments involving typhus, freezing, and other deadly conditions. Despite this background, Schreiber was brought to the United States in 1951 to work at the Air Force School of Aviation Medicine in Texas. His recruitment caused a scandal when it became public. Survivors of Nazi medical experiments learned that Schreiber was living comfortably in Texas and working for the American government. They organized protests. The media covered the story. There was significant public outrage that America was employing someone who had been involved in Nazi medical crimes. Under this pressure, the United States government agreed to send Schreiber to Argentina in 1952, essentially exporting the problem rather than prosecuting him. He lived in Argentina until his death in 1970, the full scope of Operation Paperclip. The examples of von Braun, Rudolph, Strughold, Blome, and Schreiber represent only a small fraction of the total number of Germans recruited through Operation Paperclip. The program brought over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to the United States. They worked in fields including rocketry, aerodynamics, aviation medicine, chemical weapons, biological weapons, electronics, submarine, technology, and numerous others. They worked at military bases, government laboratories, universities, and private corporations throughout the United States. Many of these Germans had been members of the Nazi Party. Many had been members of the SS. Many had used slave labor from concentration camps. Some had been involved in war crimes or crimes against humanity. All of this was deliberately hidden from the American public and even from many government officials who did not have access to classified information. The deception was systematic and was carried out by multiple government agencies over many years. The justification that was always given, both at the time and in later years when the program became public knowledge, was that winning the Cold War required making difficult moral compromises. American officials argued that if the United States did not recruit these Nazi scientists, the Soviet Union would recruit them instead. They argued that the scientific and technological knowledge these Germans possessed was simply too valuable to allow it to fall into Soviet hands. They argued that the ends justified the means, that winning the Cold War and protecting American national security was more important than punishing Nazi crimes that had already occurred and could not be undone. The Messerschmitt Me 262. Nazi Germany developed the world's first operational jet-powered fighter aircraft, the Messerschmitt Me 262. This aircraft first flew in 1942 and entered combat service in 1944. It was dramatically faster than any Allied aircraft, capable of speeds up to 550 miles per hour, about 150 miles per hour faster than the fastest Allied fighters. It was armed with four 30mm cannons and could carry rockets for attacking bomber formations. The Me-262 represented a revolutionary advance in aviation technology and gave German pilots an enormous advantage when they could engage Allied aircraft. However, the Me-262 had significant problems that prevented it from changing the outcome of the war. It was mechanically unreliable, with engines that lasted only about 25 hours before failing. It required long runways and was vulnerable during takeoff and landing. Germany lacked the resources to produce it in sufficient numbers. Allied air superiority meant that Me-262s were often destroyed on the ground. Hitler made the strategic mistake of insisting that the Me-262 be modified to serve as a bomber rather than focusing on its potential as a fighter. Despite these problems, the Me-262 was a technological marvel that showed the potential of jet propulsion for military aviation. When American forces captured Me-262 aircraft and the factories where they were produced, American aviation experts were shocked by how advanced the technology was. The United States had been working on jet engines, but American jet technology was at least 2 years behind what Germany had achieved. American engineers immediately began studying captured Me-262 aircraft in detail. They disassembled the engines to understand how they worked. They examined the aerodynamics of the aircraft's design. They tested captured aircraft to understand their performance characteristics. They interviewed German engineers who had designed and built the aircraft. The knowledge gained from studying the Me-262 significantly accelerated American jet aircraft development. Several features of the Me-262's design were incorporated into early American jet fighters. The swept-wing design, which reduces drag at high speeds, was adopted in American aircraft. Engine technology was studied and improved upon. The overall concept of jet-powered combat aircraft, which the United States had been exploring but had not yet fully committed to, became a top priority because the Me-262 had proven it was viable and effective. German engineers in American aviation, beyond just studying captured aircraft, the United States recruited German aviation engineers through Operation Paperclip. These engineers had worked for German aircraft manufacturers like Messerschmitt, Heinkel, Junkers, and others. They brought with them years of experience and knowledge about jet propulsion, high-speed aerodynamics, and advanced aircraft design. They went to work for American aircraft companies and for the United States Air Force, contributing to the development of American jet aircraft throughout the late 1940s and 1950s. One significant example was Alexander Lippisch, who had designed swept-wing and delta-wing aircraft for Germany during the war. After being recruited through Operation Paperclip, Lippisch worked for Convair, an American aircraft manufacturer, where his work influenced the design of several experimental and operational American aircraft. His research on delta-wing designs contributed to aircraft like the Convair F-102, Delta Dagger, and F-106 Delta Dart, which became important interceptors during the Cold War. The Type 25 U-boat Nazi Germany developed the Type 25 U-boat late in World War II, and it represented a revolutionary advance in submarine technology. Previous submarines were really surface ships that could temporarily submerge. They operated primarily on the surface, submerging only to attack or to hide. They were slow underwater and had to surface frequently to recharge their batteries. The Type 24 was the first true submarine, designed to operate primarily underwater for extended periods. The Type 24 had several revolutionary features. It had a streamlined hull that reduced drag underwater, allowing it to travel at higher speeds while submerged than previous submarines. It could reach 17 knots submerged, compared to only 7 or 8 knots for earlier U-boats. It had much larger battery capacity, allowing it to remain submerged for several days at a time. It had a snorkel, which was a tube that allowed the submarine to run its diesel engines while remaining just below the surface, recharging batteries without fully surfacing. It had advanced sound dampening technology that made it much quieter than previous submarines. It had hydraulic loading systems for its torpedoes, allowing it to reload and fire much faster than earlier submarines. If the Type 24 had been available earlier in the war and in larger numbers, it could have dramatically changed the Battle of the Atlantic. The combination of speed, endurance, and stealth would have made it extremely difficult for Allied anti-submarine forces to detect and sink. However, Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing by the time the Type 21 became operational, and only 2 ever conducted combat patrols before the war ended. Neither sank any Allied ships, because by that point, in May 1945, Germany was in the process of surrendering. The United States captured several Type 21 U-boats intact at the end of the war. American naval engineers studied them intensively. They tested them at sea to evaluate their performance. They disassembled them to understand their construction and systems. The technology and design principles of the Type 21 directly influenced American submarine development for decades after the war. The United States Navy's first submarines designed after the war, including the Tang-class submarines commissioned in the early 1950s, incorporated features learned from the Type 21. These included the streamlined hull design, larger battery capacity, improved sound dampening, and hydraulic systems. These features made American submarines substantially more effective than the submarines the United States had operated during World War II. When the United States developed nuclear-powered submarines beginning in the 1950s, the basic hull design and many operational concepts came from the Type 21. The Soviet Union also captured Type 21 U-boats and German submarine engineers, and Soviet submarine development followed a similar pattern of incorporating German technology. The result was that for decades after World War II, submarine design around the world was heavily influenced by German engineering from the Type 21. The German innovation of Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war in German, was the military doctrine that Nazi Germany used to achieve rapid victories in the early years of World War II. The doctrine emphasized speed, surprise, and the coordinated use of different types of military forces working together. The basic concept was to use fast-moving armored units supported by aircraft to break through enemy defensive lines, then to rapidly advance deep into enemy territory, surrounding and isolating enemy forces before they could retreat or reorganize. The key elements of Blitzkrieg included tanks organized into large armored divisions that could move quickly and hit hard, mechanized infantry that moved in trucks or armored vehicles so they could keep pace with the tanks, close air support from dive bombers and fighter aircraft that attacked enemy positions just ahead of the advancing ground forces, and excellent communications using radio to coordinate all these different elements in real time. The psychological effect was as important as the physical destruction. Blitzkrieg was designed to overwhelm and demoralize the enemy, through the shock and speed of the attack. Germany used blitzkrieg successfully in Poland in 1939, conquering the country in just 5 weeks. Germany used it in France in 1940, achieving in 6 weeks what Germany had failed to do in 4 years during World War I. Germany used it in the Soviet Union in 1941, advancing hundreds of miles in the first few weeks and surrounding entire Soviet armies. Eventually, the Blitzkrieg doctrine failed when Germany faced enemies with greater resources and when German forces became overextended, but in the early war years it was devastatingly effective. American adoption of combined arms doctrine. The United States Army studied German blitzkrieg tactics carefully, both during the war by analyzing German operations and after the war by interviewing captured German generals and studying German military documents. American military theorists recognized that the Germans had developed an effective way of using modern technology in warfare. The fundamental principle of coordinating tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft in rapid mobile operations became central to American military doctrine. After World War II, the United States Army reorganized itself based partly on lessons learned from German operations. The concept of armored divisions with integrated infantry, artillery, and air support became standard. The emphasis on mobility, speed, and overwhelming force at the point of attack became core principles of American military planning. During the Cold War, American war plans for defending Western Europe against a potential Soviet invasion were based on concepts of mobile defense and counterattack that drew heavily on German experience. This influence continued into later conflicts. During the Gulf War in 1991, the American military's strategy of rapid armored advances with close air support, which quickly defeated the Iraqi army in just 100 hours of ground combat, was essentially an application of combined arms doctrine that had its origins in German blitzkrieg tactics. Military historians have noted the irony that American forces used tactics originally developed by Nazi Germany to achieve American military objectives decades later. Reinhard Gehlen and the Gehlen Organization. Reinhard Gehlen was a German army general who had been in charge of military intelligence for the Eastern Front during World War II. His organization, called Fremde Heere Ost, which means Foreign Armies East, was responsible for gathering intelligence about the Soviet Union. Gehlen had built an extensive network of spies and informants throughout Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. He had detailed files on Soviet military capabilities, Soviet leadership, and Soviet intelligence operations. As Germany collapsed in 1945, Gehlen recognized that his intelligence about the Soviet Union would be extremely valuable to the Americans, who were already beginning to see the Soviet Union as a potential future enemy. Gehlen carefully preserved his intelligence files. He had them microfilmed and buried in metal containers in the Bavarian Alps. Then he surrendered to American forces and offered a deal. He would provide his intelligence files and help establish an intelligence network for the Americans in exchange for protection, funding, and the ability to continue his work. American intelligence officers recognized the value of what Gehlen was offering. The United States knew relatively little about the Soviet Union, which had been an ally during the war, but was rapidly becoming an adversary. Gehlen had years of experience and extensive information. The Americans agreed to Gehlen's proposal. They recovered his buried intelligence files. They brought Gehlen to the United States, where he was debriefed extensively. Then They sent him back to Germany with American funding to rebuild his intelligence organization, now working for the United States rather than for Nazi Germany. The Gehlen organization, as it became known, operated from 1946 until 1956 as the primary American intelligence service in West Germany. It employed thousands of Germans, many of whom had worked for Nazi intelligence services during the war. It ran spy networks throughout Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. It provided intelligence to the United States military and to the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency. The Gehlen organization eventually became the BND, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, which is the foreign intelligence service of West Germany and later of reunified Germany. The problem with the Gehlen organization was that it was thoroughly compromised by Soviet intelligence from the beginning. The Soviets had infiltrated Gehlen's organization during World War II, and many of his agents were actually double agents working for the Soviets. When Gehlen rebuilt his organization for the Americans, these Soviet agents came with him. As a result, much of the intelligence that the Gehlen organization provided to the United States was either inaccurate or was deliberately false information fed by the Soviets. Soviet intelligence knew about many American intelligence operations because Gehlen's organization leaked information to them. The Americans did not fully realize how compromised the Gehlen organization was until years later. Despite these serious problems, the American decision to work with Gehlen represented a significant shift in American intelligence methods. The United States was willing to work with former Nazi intelligence officers to employ people who had committed war crimes in service of the Third Reich, because the perceived need for intelligence about the Soviet Union outweighed moral objections. This set a precedent that continued throughout the Cold War, with American intelligence services frequently working with questionable individuals and organizations because they provided useful intelligence or other services. The nature of Nazi medical experiments. Nazi doctors conducted hundreds of cruel and deadly medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners between 1939 and 1945. These experiments were performed without consent and with complete disregard for the suffering and lives of the prisoners. The experiments included exposing prisoners to extreme cold to study hypothermia and test methods for rewarming frozen pilots and sailors, subjecting prisoners to extreme air pressure and rapid decompression to simulate conditions at high altitude, infecting prisoners with diseases like typhus, tuberculosis, and malaria to test vaccines and treatments, performing unnecessary surgeries and amputations to test medical techniques, forcing prisoners to drink seawater to study how long people could survive without fresh water, and many other horrific procedures. Thousands of prisoners died during these experiments or from their after effects. Many more survived, but suffered permanent physical and psychological damage. The experiments violated every principle of medical ethics. They treated human beings as expendable research subjects. The doctors who conducted these experiments were prosecuted at the Nuremberg trials. 7 were sentenced to death and executed. 9 received prison sentences. However, many Nazi doctors who had been involved in these experiments were never prosecuted, and some were actually recruited by the United States or other Allied countries. Did the United States use data from Nazi experiments? This question has been debated by historians and ethicists for decades, and it remains controversial. The documented facts are these. American military and intelligence personnel seized extensive records from Nazi medical research facilities at the end of the war. These records included detailed reports of human experiments. American researchers studied these records to understand what the Nazis had done and what results they had obtained. Some of this information was presented as evidence at the Nuremberg trials. Some of it was classified and kept secret. There is clear evidence that American military researchers read and evaluated Nazi medical research data. There is evidence that this data was discussed in scientific conferences and meetings. There is evidence that some American researchers considered the Nazi data to be scientifically valuable despite the horrific and unethical means by which it was obtained. The controversial question is whether American researchers actually used this data in developing American medical treatments or military procedures. Several specific cases have been documented. American aviation medicine researchers studied Nazi experiments on high-altitude conditions and hypothermia because the United States Air Force and Navy needed to understand these conditions for their pilots and sailors. There is evidence that information from Nazi experiments influenced American military protocols for survival in cold water and at high altitude. American researchers working on biological and chemical weapons studied Nazi research in those areas. Some Nazi doctors who had conducted human experiments were brought to the United States specifically to share their knowledge with American researchers. The ethical problem is profound. If researchers use data obtained through criminal experiments, are they complicit in those crimes? Does using such data validate the experiments and dishonor the victims? On the other hand, if the experiments have already been done and the victims are already dead, does refusing to use the data mean their suffering was completely pointless? These questions have no easy answers, and different ethicists have reached different conclusions. In recent decades, there has been growing recognition that American researchers did use some data from Nazi medical experiments, and that this was ethically wrong. Some medical journals that published articles based partly on Nazi research have issued apologies and retractions. Some institutions that employed Nazi doctors have acknowledged their errors and apologized. However, the full extent of how Nazi medical research influenced American medicine remains unclear because many relevant documents remain classified.